Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm really, I gotta say, I'm absolutely astonished to see so many people. I've now spoken, in fact, I've spoken quite a lot about Haiti today because I've been chaperoned all over town by you, Niraj, and by your son, Kabir and John. But I mean, it's a trivial personal point, but I've worked in isolation in London on this issue, really without anybody to talk to. So a lot on the work of people here in Chan. I imagine many of you know this stuff, but I just want to put a bit of a plug and repeat what has already been said. In fact, the importance of the work that Chan is doing, really extraordinary. For me, individually, again, it hardly matters, but it was a real source of inspiration in the sense of, simply the sense that you're not crazy, you know, that to be pursuing this thing kind of on your own, that what you're saying is reasonable, and that this is what, you know, other people who are also seem reasonable are thinking and doing in different kinds of contexts, and that makes a big, big difference, I think. So to see how incredibly well organized Chan is, that you can, you know, so many people can come together to have a meeting about this issue, and what that makes possible, and it was the same yesterday in Ottawa, it was the same the day before in Montreal. I can tell you from personal experience now, there is a genuine mobilization of people who care about this issue and who collectively can make a real difference. So I really take my hat off to the people in Chan, you know, the people who are here, the people who are in Ottawa, people like Kevin Scared, people like Roger Annis, people like Anthony Fenton and Eve Engler. I really want to put a plug in for the book that Anthony and Eve wrote, Canada and Haiti. If you haven't yet seen it, you can see that it's beautifully small. It's much smaller than Damming the Flood. And it'll give you a very good picture of the issue. If you're not, you know, if you're coming to this relatively new, I think it's a really great place to start, both as a general history of what happened, and particularly, of course, with the focus on Canada's role. So I wanted to start with that. What I'm going to do now, I see this as a kind of meeting. I don't really like the idea of somebody who stands up front and appears to know all the answers. I can tell you that it's not at all the case. You know, there's nothing that authorized me to write this thing, apart from the simple fact of having time to do so and some interest. But otherwise, in every other respect, I'm just, you know, like many other people, it was a book that could have been written by anybody with a bit of time to do it. I have no inside track whatsoever. I've been to Haiti twice, which is nothing like enough times. I know a few people there now, but I have no particular connection to the place apart from a general academic interest and some sympathy with the principles that animate both the Haitian Revolution and more recently the Lavalas movement. But in no sense do I feel at all like an expert. I mean, I assembled some work. A lot of it was done here in Canada. And so I want to emphasize that. I don't feel in any sense like an expert up front. I think it's more a matter of an occasion to pool resources and compare notes and see, you know, pool our collective intelligence so as to be able to make some kind of difference on this issue. And what I'm going to do for, you know, 40 minutes or so is try and give an outline of how I see this, the subtitle of that book, The Politics of Containment, how I see that being deployed in Haiti. In a way, it's the history of Haiti from the beginning. As has already been said, the Haitian Revolution that ends in 1804, that triggers a huge backlash, a huge attempt to quarantine and isolate this place that had broken the bonds of imperial domination in the place where they were strongest. You know, Haiti was the most heavily exploited, the most dominated colony in the Caribbean, more profitable than the whole of, you know, the 13 colonies at the time when that comparison would have meant something. And in order for the Haitians to become independent, they had to defeat the armies of Spain, of Britain, of France several times. They had to overcome internal divisions. And it was a monumental, incredible achievement. My own view, and there are many people who think this, is that it was the most extraordinary and subversive revolution in the whole of modern history. Because not only did it affirm universal human rights in the same way, broadly speaking, that had been done in France, and to some extent in the United States somewhat before, but it did it without any exceptions. You know, no caveats for slavery, for the colonies, for black people, for other people. It was a genuine universal affirmation. And that triggered a politics of containment, both to begin with international, that tried to stifle this country. The war killed a third of the population. It destroyed virtually the entire economy. You know, all the plantations destroyed, the towns sacked, ruined. France then compounds that with an international embargo designed to destroy the economy of the country. They lifted, many of you will know the story, only in exchange for an absolute outright extortion of money, supposedly to compensate the colonizers for property lost during the revolution. In other words, the slaves who won the war had to pay the French off for their own freedom. The amount is absolutely staggering, 150 million francs, reduced later to 90 million that, if you work it out in terms of what Haiti actually paid, and they paid this through the 19th century, they finished paying in 1947, it comes out, RC's people calculated it out at about the equivalent of $21 billion, right? And the amount was so huge that by the end of the 19th century, 80% or so of the Haitian budget went into paying the interest on the loans to pay off that one payment to France, okay? So this is part of the politics that contained Haiti from the beginning, that impoverished the country, that stifled it and quarantined it. There's also, unfortunately, there was a domestic equivalent of this, insofar as the affranchis, the people who had worked most closely with the French, the people who had been overseers, the people who had been, in some sense, brought into the colonial apparatus. Some of these people, at least, became the new elite, inevitably, perhaps. And a kind of internal counter-revolution began very quickly in the 19th century, and in some sense it's going on as we speak. So I'm going to talk about the more recent phase of this politics of containment, particularly that crystallizes around the two coups that overthrow Aristide in 1991 and 2004. I want to pay attention particularly to the 2004 coup, and what's new, what was different about this coup. Some of it's very familiar, but some of it is slightly different. Partly because it's so important in Haiti, but also because it's an example, it's like a laboratory for a new kind of politics of deflection, misinformation, subversion, and containment that applies in other contexts as well. I think, if you want to put it very crudely, and the point was made very well the other day by a professor in California, Mike Davis. He said, you know, we can think of this in a kind of continuum between Iraq on one extreme and Haiti on the other. That Iraq is a model of a kind of direct, brutal military aggression, followed up, you know, through all the torturous business in Abu Ghraib and the airstrikes and the use of massive military power, complemented then later by so-called reconstruction projects, right, that are funded to some extent by American taxpayers, that work through big American multinationals like Halliburton, Bechtel, and so on. But it's very expensive. You know, to control a country that way, it's expensive, it's difficult, and it's not successful. It's not working very well. The State Department itself is very unhappy with the results of this little experiment in Iraq. And I don't think that that is the way that American imperial power is going to be deployed again anytime soon. You know, it's simply too expensive. It doesn't get the job done. You know, it provokes too many complications. You have, meanwhile, though, another experiment going on in Haiti, another form of stabilization and reconstruction, much cheaper, much more efficient. And so far, it's working a treat. The media seems to accept it, that the UN is there in a kind of quote-unquote stabilizing role, that the humanitarian community, the NGOs, the governments like Canada and the United States and France are there sponsoring development and bringing Haiti into something like modern liberal democracy. That's the idea. And the world so far has bought this picture and has accepted that what is going on there is a kind of incredibly, is a kind of transition to democracy after a regrettable burst of tyranny, sort of a throwback to the Duvalier dictatorship. And that what the UN and the Canadian government and various others is overseeing is this beautiful transition to a kind of modern, a modern future in Haiti. And that's the step that I think that we should be, that we should analyze, that we should reject, that we should learn from, because I think this is a strategy that we're going to see reproduced and replicated in other places, starting, I think, with Venezuela. We'll see what happens in Cuba. We'll see what happens in Venezuela. But I think I think this has a what's happening in Haiti. Haiti has often been thought of as a kind of laboratory for forms of power. There's a phrase in Haiti, if you've been there, the laboratoire, the phrase that people use for the kind of CIA Pentagon machine is a place that experiments in a way on what they can get away with in a place like Haiti. So that's what I want to talk about. I want to preface it by saying why it's so difficult. And why is it? I mean, it's not difficult in the sense that you can find the information easily enough. People are incredibly helpful. If you start poking around, you can get what you. I think you can find out what you need to know. Even if you, like me, if you hardly speak Creole at all, you can communicate quite effectively if you have a bit of patience and if you talk to people with goodwill. And that was overwhelmingly my experience. But it's difficult because the bias is so intense. Part of it is simple racism. Part of it is the legacy, decades of misinformation. I want to give you a symptom of this. Some of you might remember this incident, and some of you will remember it very well, but last spring, in May, so it was May 4th, 2007, there was an accident in the Caribbean. A boat load of migrants set off on the 2nd of May from Cap Haitien, heading north, and shooting for the Turks and Caicos Islands. That's a British colony, overseas territory is the technical phrase, just north of Haiti, about miles or so north of Haiti, and it's a place where a lot of the most desperate Haitian migrants try to go. There's some work there, you know, they get horribly exploited in hotels, and they do jobs like cleaning streets and do some agricultural work, as happens in other places like the Dominican Republic and Florida and Quebec and so on. And there are several thousand people trying to get to the Turks and Caicos Islands, you know, the people who have lost basically everything. And on that night, a boatload of migrants was intercepted by the Turks and Caicos Coast Guard about 2 in the morning, under heavy seas. And then we're talking about a boat, a 25-foot boat. That's, you know, from here to the pillar, just about, maybe a tiny bit bigger, with 160 people crammed in, you know, to under a cabin and on the boat itself. They're caught by the Coast Guard. People are panic a little bit. They come out on board, and the Coast Guard incredibly decides to tow the boat under these circumstances. This is a thing that even the U.S. Coast Guard, not exactly the most enlightened institution in the world, would never consider doing. You know, the U.S. used to do that. They stopped doing it because they say if you do that, you kill people. You know, it's inevitable that there will be an accident if you try and tow a boat with a large number of panicking people who are swirling around on a tiny boat like that. Stability disappears, and if you then tow it in heavy seas, catastrophe is inevitable. And sure enough, the boat capsized shortly afterwards, and 80 people died that night. You know, some of them were left clinging to the hull of the boat for hours. And what is spectacular about it, I mean, by itself, you could say, well, this is an incident and similar things have happened. This is one of the worst as it happened. But what amazes me about this is that this was the night after the disappearance of a British girl in Portugal, Madeleine McCann. You might remember that story. I imagine, in fact, you remember it well. The British press was all over this. It was an actual national obsession. A paper like The Guardian ran an average of 2 stories about Madeleine McCann every day for the next 6 months. Okay, it was, you know, it became a story about the story. You know, why are we so preoccupied? You know, all these white British fears about their children being pinched by pedophiles, foreigners, you know, mysterious forces. I don't know exactly what it was. And how much coverage do you think, you know, but in any case, this is a girl who disappears in Portugal. It's not British responsibility whether, you know, the British were the victim of something that happened. Here we have an incident where 80 people are killed by what is clearly criminal negligence of authorities that work hand in hand with the British state, who are supervised by the British Coast Guard, who are part, essentially, of the British Empire. Nothing in the press at all. The Guardian, the most progressive paper, someone mentioned it a second ago, the most progressive paper in the UK never mentioned this story, not a single word. You know, the Observer, which is the Sunday paper that works in conjunction with the Guardian, mentioned it once, 135 words clipped from the Associated Press. That was it. Daily Telegraph never mentioned it, Financial Times never mentioned it. The Times had a 2-sentence article on this incident, that's it. You know, so that's what you're dealing with. If you generalize that story and consider how that might play out then in terms of more political incident, you can see that you're up against a machine. You know, this is systematic, major misrepresentation, distortion, filtering. That means that Haiti news simply doesn't appear in the mainstream. So if you rely mainly on the mainstream media, you cannot understand what's going on in Haiti. It's impossible. So that makes it difficult. The story, though, that story that I want to tell briefly is not complicated at all. I think what happened with these 2 coups can be described pretty simply as an evolution in a strategy of containment from a pretty explicitly military one, a kind of military political solution, to a para-political and paramilitary solution. That's how I would generally describe it. I'll just summarize what happened basically. Back in 1990, so in the late 80s, if you remember, the Duvalier dictatorships control Haiti from the late 50s through to 1986. Okay, and they do this through a combination of kind of neo-feudal economic pressure, keeping people dispersed on, and partly because people chose to remain in small farms. Compounded with sharecropping strategies that make it extremely difficult for people to accumulate anything like some kind of income that they could then invest. So that poverty remains extremely, you know, severe, and but it's not total destitution. You know, at that point in the 1960s, people are living maybe on something like, if you measure it in $200 that get tagged back to the year 2000, maybe $800 a day is the average income in Haiti. So it's tiny, but it's not destitution. You know, it's not absolute abject misery. And it's maintained then by a kind of neo-feudal structure of section chiefs, like the local sheriffs, who work with the army and who work with paramilitary squads, particularly the Tonton Macoutes, a group that are notorious, I'm sure you've heard of their reputation, who are often the standard figure for the amount of political killings that they're responsible for is 50,000 people, right? So over the course of particularly of François Duvalier's regime. So you have a combination then of kind of neo-feudal economic exploitation compounded by direct paramilitary oppression, and that pacifies people. That keeps things quiet in Haiti, and Haiti is an exceptionally quiet place in the 1960s. The CIA is very impressed. They say, you know, and I quote this in the book, they say that there's a report in the 1970s, he said that the economic downshredding is so severe that people are so destitute that they are politically dormant and there's no threat of communism here. We don't need to worry about it. Haiti is safe, you know, and as long as the Duvalier system works, you know, we don't have to worry about it. The problem is that it's not sustainable in the long run, partly because of the pressure of neoliberalism. This is a long story, but means that the economic exploitation in the countryside becomes more severe. The prices of things like coffee and sugar are falling. In order to make a bit of a profit, multinationals like Hasco, the Haitian American sugar company, and simple growers, you know, smaller scale growers who were operating in Haiti, they need to put the crank on. They need to try and increase the rate of production. And that starts pushing people off their land. Land gets appropriated. You have increasing numbers of people who are forced to go into the cities and into these growing slums that become very large over the course of the 1980s and increasingly large now. And that starts to change the political balance. And various other things happen too. The liberation theology becomes an important force in Haiti, starting in the late 70s and early 80s. The groups called the Petites Églises, little church communities, a little bit like the base ecclesial communities in Brazil, become centers of political discussion in the countryside, but increasingly in these slums. People start putting their heads together, they start talking, they start thinking, they start talking about the dictatorship, and there's the level of political awareness starts to increase. You have various other factors combine. Many people have an interest in getting rid of the dictatorship. A wide swathe of people, the peasantry, organized labor such as it is, poor people from all walks of life, but also some academics, some university-type people, some professionals, some doctors, lawyers, people who had gone into exile generally in the 1960s who are keen to come back, the diaspora which is keen to sponsor some kind of political change, in part so that they could come back and benefit from something like a more open Haitian economy. And these forces combine together to create a movement that is too strong for Duvalier to keep a lid on. You know, the Duvalier regime is overthrown by the prospect of serious unrest, and that's bad for business. The American business community gets worried, they start putting pressure on the American embassy, and Duvalier is sort of funneled out. Duvalier, a hopelessly decadent, corrupt figure, it was obvious that he wasn't able to impose order, and he's replaced by the army. The army comes in 1986 and takes direct control. And they try to persist in something like a Duvalier system by imposing direct martial law, effectively, on the country. And when necessary, by applying very severe levels of force. 300 people killed in a single incident in Jean Rebel in the northwest of the country. On other incidents, you know, dozens of people are killed when there's a first attempt at elections in 1987. In total, about 1,000 or so people die in the period between 86 and 1990 when Aristide is elected. But again, it's not sustainable. It simply doesn't work. The PR damage is too severe, and this is not a good strategy for keeping people contained, for pacifying people. This is like a low-level version of the Iraq model, if you want to think of it that way. And so what happens is that a new strategy for containing the popular movement is phased in 2 phases. Let's call it 1991 phase and 2004 phase. And in 1991, 1990, the elections are eventually held after several delays in December 1990, and that's what brings to power Lavalas, led by Jean-Bertrand Aristide, with a huge mandate. You know, this is an unprecedented event in Haitian history. There's a landslide majority that he wins 67% of the vote. The American-backed candidate Marc Bazin, a technocrat, gets 14%. The Macoute candidate, you know, gets a couple of percent, and that's it. And Aristide now has this massive personal mandate for change. He was the, you know, I think it's important to say, just parenthetically, he was a source of genuine hope and inspiration, and I think perceived by the elites, perhaps with some reason, as a real threat to their continued domination. Not because he was going to become a new Fidel Castro and overthrow the regime and inaugurate a kind of social revolution. He called for a social revolution, but he called for a social revolution in the Haitian context, one that would operate within some of the existing constraints, that would slowly but surely maneuver things towards a more equitable future that would accept some of the constraints, some of the dependence that Haiti suffers in relation to international financial institutions, the United States and so on. The things that Aristide did, were relatively moderate. They got the approval of the IMF. He increased tax revenue, for example, from the rich by taxing rich companies really for the first time. But under the cover of that, he was the voice of equality, of hope, of popular emancipation, of popular empowerment, and he pushed through policies that made that a meaningful prospect for the future. Literacy programs, education programs, investment in health, some redistribution of land, other forms of land reform. He set in motion, in other words, a process that people could embrace as a genuine passage to some kind of social and political transformation. And that's the thing that was unacceptable. And the attempt then to contain this, the prospect of this transformation that would dilute the grip of the elite. You have to remember that in Haiti you have not just it's extremely poor, everybody knows it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, right? It's also by far the most unequal. If you measure this in terms of like Gini coefficients, it's really off the charts. It's way more unequal than Brazil, which is the next most unequal. Much more so than Bolivia, well more so than, say, the Philippines in another context. It's really severe, it's extreme. And the elite then, we're talking about a small group of people, maybe 5% of the population, depending on what you measure. And they're differentiated. Some of them are more feudal landowner type class, others are more professional importers, merchants, capitalists of different kinds. But they have a common interest in maintaining the status quo. Okay? And faced by Aristide, it's clear that they decided to close ranks and to find some way of containing this thing, nipping the government in the bud before it became a very bad institutional habit. And they had at their disposal two very familiar ways of doing this. One was political and the other was military. Politically, they were able to divide and disrupt this government by manipulating factionalism in the legislature. Okay, Aristide was elected, in a way he was elected too early. He was elected on the basis of the Petite Église movement, of the popular organizations that were scattered all over the country, but they didn't have a clear, disciplined political party to hold them together. So that once he was elected, and he appointed people who were veterans of that struggle, people like the agronomist René Préval as his prime minister. These are people who were not professional politicians. They didn't have links with the traditional political parties, small, little, fairly unpopular social democratic type parties. And as a result, it was quite easy for the US and for the Haitian elite themselves to create a certain amount of confusion in the legislature and to disrupt this legislative program that Préval and Aristide put forward. Okay, so that Aristide comes in February 91, by July, the parliament has basically become ungovernable. They're already talking about a vote of censure that would have seen Préval thrown out. This would have definitely happened, I think, in the autumn. And it would become very difficult to keep everybody together. There was no discipline, there was no unity. People were jockeying for position. They were resentful, if anything, of Aristide's popularity. They could see that this meant that, that their own personal prospects were going to suffer, probably. And the person that they thought they could manipulate, some of the people who had allied themselves to Aristide, assuming that they could use this country bumpkin, this guy, this slum priest, who had no political experience, found themselves actually being excluded by the popular movement, and that they were on the outside. And that means that that was the first thing. You could use this kind of political factionalism in Parliament. This is a big part of the whole story in the 1990s, the multiplication of divided little political grouplets that disrupt, confuse, fragment the political movement itself. That's the first thing. By itself is not enough, though, and the army can then step in, second weapon, if you like, to complete the job and to overthrow the government, as you know, in a coup, a military coup in September 91. This is an old-fashioned military coup. It's pretty similar in some ways to what happened in Chile in 1973, for instance. If anything, though, it's remarkable by its brutality. The army had learned a lesson. They tried to launch a preemptive coup, as many of you will know, in January 91, just before Aristide comes in. Roger Lafontaine, the arch macoute par excellence, classic Duvalieriste, tries to take power before Aristide comes in, just before, a couple of weeks before. But he doesn't do a very good job. He doesn't plan it very well, he doesn't prepare the soldiers very carefully, and he doesn't anticipate the backlash it's going to provoke. This Port-au-Prince erupts in fury, tens of thousands of people surround the National Palace, and they force him to back down. He has to give himself up after several hours to the police, and the first attempt at a military coup fails. Okay? And that means that in September, by September the army's learned its lesson. They spent several months preparing the troops. They're brainwashed into believing, or apparently believing, that Aristide represents a threat to their career, that he represents a prospect of mob rule, that he might turn the country upside down, that he's a threat to national security. They start paying out, the richest families in Haiti collect millions of dollars that gets paid out. According to the New York Times, ordinary soldiers receive about $5,000 apiece in the run-up to the coup. And that, combined with some inflammatory speeches that Aristide made as it's become increasingly clear that his back's to the wall and he calls for the people to essentially defend themselves if they're attacked, that creates a scenario in which the army is prepared to go in and launch what one American analyst called an exercise in preemptive butchery. This is someone who approved of this policy. And they kill anywhere between 300 and 1,000 people the first night. New York Times, I think, or Washington Post said 250 people in one neighborhood. A policy analyst that I talked to, who knows what he's talking about in Washington, but who I have to quote anonymously, said they shot people so fast that the U.S. had to resupply them with nighttime helicopter flights from Guantanamo. It was that kind of operation, and for several days there was just a straight-on assault in the neighborhoods in which Aristide supporters were most powerful and most militant. And this went on in slightly less extreme versions of this for 3 years. For 3 years, the army had carte blanche to decimate the popular movement, with the help of a new paramilitary organization, the FRAP, which takes shape. In fact, it's taken shape in the late 80s, but it's rebranded as the FRAP in 1993, and they conduct some of the worst operations. Their hitman, one of their main operators, is a guy called Jodel Chamblin. We're going to come back to him in a moment. And the combination then of by the end of all this, by the end of 1994, probably 5,000 people are dead. Okay, and that forces Aristide, meanwhile, is in exile. He decides he has basically really only one choice, which is, do we launch an armed movement to try and overthrow this coup and restore democracy, like many of his supporters wanted? There are a large proportion of the Haitian community, as I understand it, thought that was the way to go. Many people were extremely, militant, were extremely upset about the coup, were prepared to go and fight. Others were prepared to pay for the weapons and provide logistical support and so on. It's an open question. That's one of the things that remains, I think, a genuine debate and division. For Aristide, it was never a debate. He's a liberation theologian. Nonviolence is not negotiable for him. He will defend, controversially in the eyes of some, he will defend forms of defensive violence. This is why, if you might remember, Aristide was often presented as a kind of defender of mob rule. That's because he refused to condemn forms of defensive violence, in particular the déchoucage of the Makouts, when people rose up in 1986 and after, essentially to lynch some of the most notorious Makouts, people who have been responsible for the killing of dozens and dozens of people in their communities. And there was a popular settling of scores in 1986, when some dozens of Makouts were lynched in operations that are slightly similar to the necklacing that happened in Soweto, for example, for very similar reasons. How does a popular movement defend itself against the Makouts, against the army, against police informants, when you have no rule of law, when you have no police force, when you have no judiciary that can defend you? What are you supposed to do? It's a difficult question, but Aristide, if you ask me, was someone who tried to combine, and I think successfully combined, an insistence on nonviolence with a recognition that in despair, defensive violence is the only option you've got. If you don't, that is the only reason. That one thing is absolutely certain, is that if Aristide hadn't insisted on that, he would never have survived the 1980s. He was almost assassinated 4 times. There's no question that the only reason why he's alive is that some of his more militant defenders tracked down some of the people who tried to kill him and took them out. And that's the side of the story that people who want Aristide to be another Gandhi or another kind of saint who would never compromise with any form of violence, that's something they're not comfortable with. It's a fact, I think, on the ground there, and it's a fact, it's a reason why people are so committed to Aristide, is that you recognize that this is a fact of life if you live in these places. We can come back to this. So that was the first strategy. You have the threat of something like a popular mobilization that crystallizes around the election of this new government, and it is contained and thwarted by a combination of political maneuvering in parliament and then straight military intervention once it becomes necessary. By the time we get to 2000, 2004, it's quite a different story, and the main reason for that is that Aristide and Lavalas have solved both these problems.